Well, let me officially welcome you, everybody, to the first of the Social Contract Research Network seminars of 2024. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce a speaker whose work I have been sort of dipping into like a honeypot for about 2 or 3 years now, to great profit. It's one of the real standout books that I've read in the context of the work I'm doing on the state of nature, and it is my absolute delight to be able, therefore, to welcome Stéphanie Martens to give our seminar today. Stéphanie is an associate professor in law and justice in the School of Liberal Arts at Laurentian University in Canada, and she's also a visiting professor at York University. She specializes in political theory and the history of political thought. And in 2016, she published the book that I was raving about just a moment ago, called The Americas in Early Modern Political Theory, with Palgrave Macmillan. Just to give you a sense of the argument that this book is making really persuasively, in my opinion, it's exploring the significant impact that the discovery of the Americas had on European political thought during this period. So it's considering how the New World was received as a shock to existing categories of knowledge in early modern Europe. It's dealing with thinkers like Thomas More, Jean Baudin, Thomas Hobbes, and how they use the Americas. And I think use is often the correct term there, to illustrate ideas about sovereignty and property rights, and of course the state of nature, which is one of our main concerns in this seminar. One of the arguments that really stood out to me, and that I keep coming back to in my own thinking, is that aboriginality is actually the cornerstone of modern political thought, partly in the way that it sets the limit of the political. It dictates who is excluded from the political and therefore defines the political. I thought that was a particularly powerful idea. Not to embarrass Stéphanie too much, I will just pull out a couple of lines from the book that I found particularly elegantly written. There was, conceptions of the other are more often than not misconceptions of oneself. And there's a term that Stéphanie uses in the book to talk about the state of nature. It's the far away, long ago fallacy, which is one of those terms that we all seek in our writing, isn't it? That just encapsulates so much and clarifies so much in very few words. So the short version of this is I am absolutely delighted, therefore, to be able to welcome our speaker for this seminar, Stéphanie Martens, who today will speak to the title Civilization and Its Others, American Imaginaries, State of Nature and Civility in Hobbes. Please do join me in welcoming Stéphanie Martens.
Thank you very much. And good evening. I think it is the evening for most of you, or good morning if you are listening in from the same time zone I am speaking from, which is Toronto time zone, Eastern Daylight Savings Standard. Yeah, sorry. I'll stop. I don't know my time zone names. And thank you very much, Chris, for this introduction. This is very kind, and I'm very glad that that some of the things I explored in that book, which was my doctoral research, can be useful, can make sense, and can trigger new questions and new ways to look at things. And as you can tell right away from me speaking as well is that although I am speaking from the Greater Toronto area, I am not originally Canadian. I am originally from France, and I grew up in France and did most of my undergrad studies over there, and a little bit in Australia as well. And so as many people who spoke English as adults, and many French people who speak English and who learn to speak English as adults, I still have a very strong French accent. So I apologize in advance for that. It is kind of, I'd say, probably an experience that you may not have, that my students regularly have, to hear me quoting Hobbes, Hobbes' English text with a French accent. That can be quite a thing. Please trust that my understanding of English is actually better than the speaking and the accent. Okay, so I'll start right away with this presentation, and this is actually kind of past work revisited, and here I'm gonna based myself for this presentation mostly on an article that was published in Hobbes Studies last year in 2023, November, I think, issue. Normally, this article should have been written for the special issue Hobbes and Race, and I wasn't able to finish my manuscript on time, so it was included in the following issue. I'm not going to discuss race theory, and race approaches as much as I did in the article itself, which was meant to talk to those debates. I'll mention it a little bit, because part of the argument that I proposed in this article is to say that race is not the issue there. Civilization is the issue with Hobbes. So the main purpose of this study now is to look at what Hobbes has to say about the Americas, first of all, which is very little, but quite significant. It's also to look at Hobbes' construction and depiction of the state of nature in relation to the Americas, and to look at Hobbes' lexicon of civility, so around the idea of civility, civil society, and so on. Looking mostly at his works in English, but actually all the corpus is relevant. And so this is the paper for Hobbes Studies, and this presentation today was the occasion and is the occasion now to revisit my doctoral work, which was then the book that you've spoken about, Chris. I have to say that it might not be as up to date as I would like it to be, although maybe in the last section we can talk about this a little bit more, recent scholarship on those issues. But right now, and in the past years, I have worked mostly on Foucault and Nietzsche, which is not directly related to this, although I would argue it is, kind of. But Michel Foucault has always been a key reference for me during all of my studies and my work, and the way I approach history of ideas is very indebted, sorry, I can't really say it. I owe Michel Foucault a lot for this. So let me just show you the outline I have prepared for today. I've split it roughly here in 4 parts.
Oh,
or 4
sorry,
sections.
Stephanie, I beg your pardon. I don't think your screen is shared.
Oh, it's not shared? Excuse me. Here we go. That might help.
It's wonderful. Perfect.
Okay. So, yes, roughly 4 sections, 4 parts. The first one, Hobbes and the Americas. So with first looking very briefly at the way the Americas are imagined in the 16th and the 17th century, and also looking at depictions and imaginations of the Americas in Hobbes. And in that case, I'm not going to do like in my article, I'm not going to rely on text as much. I'm literally going to rely on images and Hobbes' frontispiece. And in this case, it is not the Leviathan frontispiece, but the probably not as famous, but still quite important and famous frontispiece of De Kive. We'll look a little bit at civilization. Civilization is one of these terms that we probably don't think about enough or take as granted too often with its advantages and weaknesses. So we'll look a little bit more at this and how Hobbes himself uses not civilization itself, but the idea of being civilized or to civilize. This would lead us to kind of conclude on the importance of what I call the American discrete background here in Hobbes' text. And this third section title is a little bit of a pun. I apologize. It is a pun on a title by James Tully, the Canadian political theorist, one of his first books, I think drawn from his PhD thesis, which I'm not sure, I didn't have time to check, but it's Locke in Context, plural. And this is the book where he analyzes the importance of the Americas in Locke's second treatise on government and in the chapter on property in particular. So I've tried to do something similar with Hobbes in my work. And the argument defended here is similar as well, but for Hobbes. And then finally, if we have time, we can talk about the implications of this for history of ideas in terms of epistemology, but also methodology and so on. So imagining the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries, I'm going to talk a little bit about the far away, long ago fallacy that you've mentioned, but I just want to kind of, I don't know, bring back images from European depictions of the Americas, so early European depictions of the Americas, and probably the name that is almost synonymous with those depictions of the Americas is Théodore de Bry, and the engraving that Théodore de Bry produced for several works on the Americas. This one is coming from collected travels on the East Indies and West Indies. Very important, very famous. As I was looking for images today, I noticed that many American universities have virtual shows and displays, in particular of the engravings on Virginia and so on. So it's still very much an important artistic contribution. And I think most of the imagery that we associate with the New World and with that period is actually Théodore de Bry-esque, or something like that, if we may make that expression. And that one, excuse me, I'm going back. We'll see that it's important. I've chosen that one. I guess there is some gold pouring in the mouth of conquistador on the forefront there. But I've chosen that one because it depicts cannibalism or taking human bodies apart. It actually depicts eating it if you look at one of the central figure at the top here as well. So taking human bodies apart, cooking it, consuming it. Cannibalism is an obsession in the literature and in the depiction of the Americas. And So we'll see if that how that is reproduced in the frontispiece of De Kive. So what I found is when I looked, so here for my doctoral work, when I looked at this post-Columbian travel literature on the Americas, so meaning post-Renaissance, early modern, is that we had kind of a very diverse set of images, themes, and tropes at play there. And in particular, we start to have a diversity of positions in sense of sympathy or, on the contrary, antipathy towards the Americas. So leading to the myth of the noble savage, or on the contrary, the figure of the ignoble savage or dirty dog. The noble savage is pretty much as old as the discovery by Europeans of the Americas. We have it in Montaigne already in his essays. The essay on the Americas is actually titled Of Cannibals. And we have here the idea of using the noble savage to criticize the French society and the French power structures of the time. So we can have sympathetic positions. We can have a position not as sympathetic. But what I found is that very often we have recurrent commonalities, and I've grouped them into 4 groups. The first one is mythical and marvelous Americas. So we have this image of the Americas as the antipodes or antipodes. I'm sorry for the English pronunciation there. And pretty much all the Golden Age myth, Greek and Roman mythologies, find themselves a kind of location there. But we also have biblical mythology, the idea of the Americas as the Garden of Eden or things like that. And pretty much every myth, I would say, available to the late medieval reader is going to find some type of location in the new continent, in the new world. This is why also, they're going to think they're fighting monsters, Amazons, strange creatures, and so on. The second group is, or the second recurrence is, so what I call the far away, long ago fallacy. And yeah, and I don't know if I can take credit for that. Probably I can get credit for that expression, but it seems to be one of these expressions that had to exist, but when you're actually looking for someone saying it, it's not there. But I know there is some type of poem in French, which actually I couldn't find again, but that says that when we travel far away, it is like we are finding lost times and so on. But it is primitivism in a way. So this idea that the more exotic, the further away a people is, the closer it would be from the origins of mankind. And then actually, I probably don't need to explain further to an Australian audience this type of prejudices and how it applied later on, even more so than for the Americas, to Australian Aborigines. So for the Americas, this was also kind of the search for a lost past of the Europeans. And I'll say it right away because I won't comment on it later on. Hobbes does this type of analogy as well in his text. So the few mentions of savages of the Americas, we find them sometimes, I'm going to say often, but because there are few mentioned, it's not that many. But almost half of them would be in parallel with European barbarians, or the old European barbarian times and tribes. The third one is the stress of deficiencies. So what is quite striking is that once again, and this is very visible in Montaigne's essays on cannibals, but this is something that we find in that type of literature, that very often the Native Americans are characterized by what they don't have. And if the writer is sympathetic, like Montaigne, thinks that's a good thing. And we'll find the same logic with Rousseau later on. That is, this would be people that don't have envy or jealousy, or that are not power hungry, and therefore they're not as corrupted as the European societies. They would be people who don't have superfluous needs. They would be people who don't have, you know, all of the technologies or means that that would allow them to be more competitive, or once again, more power hungry and so on. So for Montaigne, it's all a good thing, meaning that they wouldn't be as corrupted and so on. But then, of course, for other authors and other writers, especially as we progress in modern times, this is going to be a sign of an utter deficiency and of the superiority of the Europeans over them. But yeah, it's very striking how they're kind of not given characteristics of their own. It's always what they don't have that Europeans have. And then finally, paradoxical naturalness. The expression here is quite awkward. But the idea is that, and we find this in the state of nature constructions as well, that at the same time, they would be very natural, that is closer to nature, linked to ideas of primitivism as well. So, you know, closer to the origin, closer to a natural way of life, closer as well to the natural environment, and so on. But yet very unnatural. And in particular, the unnaturalness aspect of it has to do with the Christian thinking of the time. And we see that in particular in the late medieval scholastic as well. Even though cannibalism was not a regular thing, dietary cannibalism certainly not, Europeans were convinced that there was cannibalism. They were convinced as well that there was human sacrifices, which might indeed have happened with the Aztecs and so on. All of this was evil and utterly unnatural for them. And it really, really, I would say, obsessed them, then bothered them to figure that out. How could they be at the same time, you know, closer to Adam and Eve, closer to a form of innocence, and yet commit this unnatural, inhuman sins of cannibalism and human sacrifice. And even in the authors that are not scholastics, you can see that there is really something that is bothering them here. So either they kind of have to deny that this is happening, or yeah, they have to put it on the side if they want to defend their naturalness, like Montaigne, or if they actually embrace this unnaturalness, then that will lead them to the dirty dog, ignoble savage type of image. So these four themes are I think, very important for this post-Columbian travel literature. And I think they're very important for Hobbes as well. And I would say one of the proof or supporting element for this is the frontispiece from the Kive. So I've cut it here. There is actually a top part, which is much more traditional. It has images and good and evil in relation to the powers above and God and so on. The one at the bottom is the one that is much more interesting for us, and in particular, the right-hand side. This is an engraving made by Jean Mathieu or Mattheus. I could not find much information on him, except that he is famous today for illustrating Ovid's Metamorphoses. And the French National Library actually has the online version of those. So it is not Theodore de Bry, but much of the way the Americas are depicted are very much inspired by Theodore de Bry's engraving here. So we'll look at some of the details a little bit more. The cannibalism is there as well. So if we look behind the main figure on the right, which is Libertas, we see that we have men hunting each other and clubbing each other on the left side. And then on the right side, we see the same idea of like taking apart, cooking, or smoking human meat or human parts. I'm sorry for the gruesome details. They really liked the gruesome details in this form of literature and in this type of images. Maybe a happier detail. There's always a luxurious flora that could be also a luxurious fauna, but actually this is one of these things. Europeans don't really, I don't think they are surprised by the animals they encounter in the Americas as by the plants, by the flora. So in this case, it's not deficient. They are deficient in that they don't have agriculture, but the natural flora is always seen as being luxurious, and we can certainly see that here. We have the depiction of a little village, which is pretty much taken from, well, taken. I'm not accusing of plagiarism there, but it's very, very similar to the way Theodore de Bry depicts a Virginian village, actually, in some of his engraving. And then probably the most important, the figure of Libertas. And here maybe I'll just go back to the, to the full depiction here so that we can see the contrast better. So on the left side, or our left, we have Imperium with a female figure of justice, but also of political power, the crown, the scepter. In the background, we have agriculture, tillage of the soil. We have some towns, villages, and we can see some church steeples. This is interesting in that case, by the way, that contrarily to Leviathan, where the sovereign will stand tall and big above all of this, in this case, much more traditional, we have Religio cutting the frontispiece, and then the religious matters and God above. So this figure, indicates justice, peace, everything seems orderly, productive, and so on. On the right-hand side, excuse me, on our right, well, we've seen the cannibalism and so on. Things are not going so well. And we have, I think, a very interesting figure here, what I call the androgynous figure. In comments I received on my work, I got in trouble, I think, once because I said, oh, and we have a man representing Libertas on the right-hand side. And then people told me, right, this is not a man. This is not a man. It's a woman. And I'm like, oh yeah, yes, maybe, yeah, it's a woman. And I think the reason why most people would say it's a woman, it's because it was the convention of the time, and because libertas in Latin is feminine. So we need to have a feminine figure. I'm not sure how far that argument goes because if I remember my Latin very well, or maybe not so well even, imperium is masculine, and yet we still have a feminine figure. So grammatic arguments only go so far, I think, on that one. But yes, I will go ahead with the convention that it has to be a female figure for this type of things, type of goddess. Or it still remains that female figure is very masculine. Usually, even in Theodore de Brie's engraving, physical strength is described, but if it is a female character or a woman depicted, we will have some breast. In this case, maybe I'm not saying it well, but I see a very masculine chest. So the legs may be a little bit less muscular, but the chest itself seems very masculine. And this is something that I have noticed in those engravings of both barbarians and of savages of the Americas, because the same thing happens with the Picts as well, and this type of engravings. It's actually very hard to distinguish male and female. And I think this is part of the prejudice that we can see illustrated here, is that this idea that somehow the genders would not be as well separated or distinguishable among these people. Once again, the unnatural naturalness we talked about. So I won't say too much on that. We can talk about it later, but there is something that is quite striking about this. So the idea here is that this American imaginaries that we've spoken about before, is the 4 recurrent themes and tropes, were transformed, and I put by Hobbes in brackets here, into a sort of aboriginal imaginary, the background against which the notion of civilization developed and endured. Of course, by aboriginal here and by aboriginality or aboriginalism, I do not refer to Australian indigenous populations. I'm taking on the etymological meaning of the term, what is from the origins. So to indicate this type of primitivism and search for the origins and the nature of mankind that we have here. This idea of aboriginality only exists in contradistinction to civilization, or the idea of civilization. That is, they are born simultaneously and they work in that type of contrast. So we have a word now for the positive side, which is civilization. We don't really have a word that would indicate that negative side. So I've chosen, for lack of a better alternative, this aboriginal in the etymological sense of the term. I put by Hobbes in bracket because we'll see that's part of, sometimes also gets me in trouble, not just, misrecognizing male and female's characters on engravings, but also, suggesting that Hobbes would have maybe willingly done that, or that there is something that is fundamental here in terms of Hobbes' intentions and purpose, which, as I'll explain a little bit more later, is certainly not the case. But I do think that his social contract theory and his text did that still. And so this transformation towards the Aboriginal imaginary and civilization is one that forces me to say a few words about civilization. And I'm realizing here I don't have my up-to-date slide, so I'm sorry, the second part is not quite there, but I'll explain. And so civilization, as I said, one of these terms that, I don't know, is so loaded and yet we don't always think about its own history or origins. And this is why I put good old civilization, or really. There is, I think, very often this instinctual idea that civilization would be as old as civilization itself. The word civilization would be as old as civilization, and then most Westerners, would go back to older Mesopotamian, Middle Eastern civilizations, and then certainly the Greek and the Romans. And then we can talk about the fall of great civilizations, and so on and so on. Well, the thing is that neither the Greeks nor the Romans had a word for civilization. Certainly, civilization comes from the root of civis, civitas, that is Latin. But if the Romans invented the idea of civitas and of citizenship, of civis, they did not invent the process of civilization or the idea of being civilized. This is a very modern idea and a very modern word. So when we look at the Oxford English Dictionary, we see that the first instance that they find of civilization is in 1656, so after Leviathan, the action or process of civilizing or becoming civilized. Also the action or process of being made civilized by an external force. So once again, what is very important to me and what makes the difference between old-fashioned civitas and civility and the modern new idea of civilization is that it is an action or process. And then we have a verb, to civilized. This one is a little bit earlier, or at least first recorded instances are noted a bit earlier, 1595, 1596. And it would take on the same form of definition. So to render civil, the process of rendering civil. And then we have a little bit of the same timeline in French, with the distinction that civiliser in French, because of the civil law, droit civil, tradition, also means when a case, a judicial case, becomes civil, so kind of changes category. This is actually the older meaning of the term civiliser in French, but then at about the same period, civiliser starts meaning as well the action of process of civilizing and so on. So it becomes social and political. Civilized is found once in Hobbes' English works. And I'll read the quotation aloud. I haven't read the famous quotation from chapter 13 about the savages in many parts of America, but so you will get the French accent on Leviathan on this one. And whereas in nations not thoroughly civilized, several numerous families have lived in continual hostility and invaded one another with private force, yet it is evident enough that they have done unjustly, or else that they had no commonwealth. So we have the very first part of the sentence that is key here, whereas in nations not thoroughly civilized. We see here that Hobbes fully embraced this idea of process. So that civility becomes a process which, in this case, has not been fully accomplished or is only in the very beginnings. And even though we don't find civilized more often in Leviathan and other English texts, we do find sometimes civil being used with that meaning where he's going to say, oh, they haven't become fully civil yet. Some nations are not fully civil, and so on. So calling upon the idea of civility as a work in progress. So, and maybe I'm switching slide a little bit too early, sorry about that, but I'll leave it like this. So the point is that Hobbes' text here participates fully in that shift of meaning around the idea of civility and civil, and this, in English, adding of the Z or the I's to it, and the idea of civility becoming the result of a civilization process that is both political, social, that is at the same time, there's more than two, political, social, cultural, and economic. And so this is very new at the time, and Hobbes participates fully in that novelty. So this is part of what I've argued in different pieces in the past, but I want to clarify a few things. So I want to take the opportunity of this presentation to clarify a few things, to go back on some of the questions that I often get. And so this is what I've titled here, Avoiding Misunderstanding. So one question or one comment I often get is that, yes, it's all very nice, you know, looking at the comments on the Americas, but let's face it, they're very anecdotal. There are very few. On the other hand, you know, English civil wars and the problems of the time are everywhere in Hobbes' text. And this is much more important to understand his theories, his positions. And in this case, my reply is yes, fully. I'm not trying to say that the European context, and in particular the English context of the time, is not the most important. It is. And in the few kind of biographical elements we have from Hobbes himself, he's being very clear about this. This was his life obsession. So I'm not suggesting, you know, that he would have a hidden American agenda. It's not as clear with John Locke, but with Hobbes, it's fairly clear that there is no hidden American agenda. There has been interesting research mentioning that he probably knew quite a little bit about the Americas. But even if he knew a little bit for the time, it is too early for him to know that much. And certainly there is no reason for him to be obsessed by the Americas and the colonization over there. So the European context, and even one could say the English context, still remain the most important to understand Hobbes' works. However, that doesn't mean that the American context is superfluous or completely inconsequential. And so this is why I think it should not be underestimated when we look at Hobbes, at Hobbes' theories, at Hobbes' concepts within that larger linguistic context. The other, I guess, misunderstanding or the other questions I often get, and I have to say, the first one is more coming from scholars, fellow professors. The second one usually comes more from students. And it has to do with the fact that a lot of post-colonial approach or critical race theory approaches talk about dehumanization in the colonization processes. And here, people ask whether I'm suggesting, you know, that Hobbes is a racist and dehumanize Native Americans and so on. And in this case, no. Hobbes does not purposely dehumanize or racialize Native Americans. There are several reasons for that. In terms of racialization, race did not mean race at the time, so could not have done this. And interestingly enough, in this period where the racist idea of race starts to emerge as well, from, I think, from what specialists are saying, the first instances of this are actually applied to the Irish and not to the Native Americans. So we don't have any of that in Hobbes. And I would also argue that we don't have any dehumanization at that time either. A full dehumanization, which would mean to deny the status of a human being or the status of personhood, was really rare, or hopefully still is really rare, and also is something that happened later on with the peak of pseudoscientific racism in the 19th century, notably. At that time, we don't have the same biological conception of humanity, first of all, and there's still this idea of Christian shared humanity that people, Europeans, do hold on to. So there is no question that the people that are found in the New World are human beings. Could they be lesser human beings, unnatural human beings, unworthy human beings? Yes, some people thought so, but they were still fully human beings. And it's also important to note, and here it's more specific to some authors. I've mentioned the late medieval scholastic, Vittoria of the Salamanca School, so a little bit before Hobbes there, as a famous piece, lecture, De Indis, where he actually fully recognized legal personhood and dominium, which is very important at the time for this type of scholars, to Native Americans. So no dehumanization, even for some authors, full recognition of personhood and the rights that are attached to it. By the way, so Vittoria recognizes this. That does not mean that his legal theories were applied in practice in South America, but in theoretical terms, he was very clear about the fact that Native Americans had dominion and therefore could not be enslaved, could not be stolen from, and so on. In the case of Hobbes, I think he's also very clear that people living in a state of nature, the savages of the Americas or the barbarians of old Europe, are fully human. And what is also very clear about is that there is no biological determinism to where one is in terms of state of nature or civil society and government. And so same thing, it's not that he comments on this very often, but there are a few comments on blood, kin, and race. And at that time, race would have meant blood, like this kind of kinship, like aristocratic race or blue blood and so on. And in Elements of Law, he writes, the question, which is the better man, is determinable only in the estate of government and policy. Through it be mistaken for a question of nature, not only by ignorant men, that think one's man blood better than another's by nature, but also by him, Aristotle, whose opinions are at this day and in these parts of greater authority than any other human writings. So we have a criticism here of Aristotle natural slave theory, but we also have very clearly the idea that there is nothing, attached to people's heredity and biological features that makes them worse or better than any other one, that would mean that they have to be in the state of nature. And in a few other passages where there are suggestions of explanations about why people would still be in the state of nature and not have come to civil society, it seems that he believed that it was kind of by a set of unfortunate circumstances. We could then think, okay, maybe no biological determinism, but then we have geographical determinism, but not really either. We are really very far from something that, Montesquieu would do later on in The Spirit of Laws, where we have full-on geographical determinism. If it's cold in your area, then you're going to have, I don't know, kinship, or it's the contrary. It's when it's warm. I'm not sure anymore. But we have the epitome of geographical determinism. There is no such thing in Hobbes. It's more like, it just didn't happen through a set of circumstances. But it can happen in the future. And similarly, it's not because it can happen in the future that it would give the European, the white man, some type of civilizing burden. No, it's just, once again, something that is much more historical And because it is historical and circumstantial, there is an aspect of randomness to it as well. I'll take a break right here, actually, because I think I might be taking a little bit too much time. I usually do that. I apologize. Chris, could you let me know how much time I have left, or if I should conclude?
You're very welcome to keep going, Stephanie. We do have time, and this is fascinating material. So please do carry on.
Okay. If I do go on too long, let me know, and I'll conclude.
I will.
So here at the end, I wanted to talk about what this type of studies and this type of interpretations can bring for political and legal thought. And so this is where I want to talk a little bit more about more recent scholarships or debates within the discipline and so on. And I think that this accidental invention of civilization is of utmost importance at two levels. First, for the modern state, generally speaking. And actually, thank you again, Chris. You've put it better than I. This is something that I've argued in the book. And so I'll summarize it once again here, but this is what you've described exactly in your introduction. I think that the colonial relationship to the Americas in particular, and to indigenous people in the Americas, is not just important for settler states such as Canada or Australia and their own colonial past and attempts at reconciliation, although I see that Australians' attempts at reconciliation may not be as willing or, or benevolent than the Canadian ones. But what I mean is that this relationship to indigenous peoples and to Native Americans, it's not just something that settler states that have a colonial history are to be worried about. Of course they are, but it's larger than this. It is the very idea of the modern state that is built from these circumstances, from this context, from this cognitive shock that happened with the discovery of the Americas. And the way that Europeans have imagined the Americas and imagined aboriginality in relationship to the Americas in the state of nature is an essential part of the way they have imagined the modern state, the modern legal system, and so on. And I do believe that Hobbes is a key author in that construction of the modern state and of the modern legal system. So I want to insist on that first level, but there is also another, maybe, probably, I would say, socially and politically way less important. But another level is that of the historical approaches to political theory. It's more of an academic concern here. I do like to worry about history and, interpretations and texts that may have little political consequence, although, once again, in a very Foucauldian way, kind of these details of the way we understand our own past, our own genealogy is actually the only way we can start thinking differently and find some form of freedom. But that's a discussion for another time. I want to say what this means for me here, and also same thing, clarify some possible misunderstandings. I'll try to do that quickly. So for me, what it means is that there is a certain historical sense that is very important to political theory itself, not just the history of ideas, but political theory itself. And I think that this approach is can actually be, I don't know, ecumenical or much more open-minded than it is often taken to be. So what this type of exercise, the interpretation of Hobbes provided here, tells us, or at least the way I want to use it, it's not to police interpretation, to say that, oh, if you've read, Hobbes as an insurance game or psychologically, that's wrong. If you've read Hobbes as a commentary on the English Civil Wars, that's wrong, and so on and so on. No, of course not. These interpretations are not only very valid, but are very important to modern political theory, and they always will be. It is certainly not to suggest that everyone has to look at Hobbes from the point of view of the Americas or the colonial relationship. What it means is that we just need to think about this historical context in a much more open-minded way. And here I'll sound a little bit Foucauldian probably. It's the idea that the marginal and the anecdotal can be actually very telling and can tell us something about the times. It won't tell us anything about the author's intentions, but that's okay. But it might tell us something about the times, and if it tells us something about the times, it tells us something about us today. And so it is not about, trying to reconcile as well post-structuralism and more traditional approaches, like, trying to find about how in the end they all agree on everything. No, they probably don't. They have very different philosophical, ontological commitments. But I think that there is still something that ties these approaches together and allows them to communicate. And so, for instance, if I were to ask, what do Leo Strauss, Quentin Skinner, Michel Foucault have in common? One may say, well, very little actually in their approaches. And I would say actually they all have a historical sense. And this idea of historical sense comes from Nietzsche. Nietzsche criticizes in Genealogy of Morals, but he also talks a lot about this in The Gay Science and Untimely Meditations. He says that the philosophers have no historical sense. This is a criticism, by the way. His insults can also be much harsher than this. But that's what I mean here, is that we have very different schools of interpretations, very different epistemological foundation for this. And yet it is always a defense of historical sense and a defense of historical approaches when doing political and legal thought. And so in a way, I am advocating for more history of ideas, maybe. And I'll leave it at that. Maybe just a few comments then on what remains to be done and where do we go from there. What remains to be done, I think, is probably more research on, yes, on those anecdotal mention of the other, of the colonial relationship in authors that may not be seen as dealing with these issues directly. I know this is what Barbara Arnell is doing with other authors. She spoke for one of your podcasts recently. She also wrote, like James Tully, on John Locke, but she's now working on other authors, doing the same thing, finding these mentions in their writing, sometimes in their journals, in unpublished papers. I think this is very important research. And where do we go from there? Maybe, as I said, much more conversation between approaches would disagree at an ideological, epistemological level, but yet still tell us something about this linguistic context of the time and how we can learn from our past. And I'll mention Leo Strauss again here, which I don't think we can accuse of being a post-structuralist or anything like that. In one of his early books on the political philosophy of Hobbes, this is one of his first books, I think written in German, actually, originally. He says that the whole idea of civilization is born with Hobbes. Of course, for him, civilization is not a problematic term, and he's not thinking about the examples of indigenous people and how they may be used in that process. But he sees very well that there is something going on with civilization there. And so similarly, Michel Foucault also saw that there was something going on with savages and barbarians. I think there are some interesting conversations still to be had at that level. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And thank you for letting me go a little bit longer.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much. I'm just trying to stop the screen share. Excellent. Do join me in thanking Stephanie for the presentation. As is our usual habit in these seminars, we will if you have a question that you'd like to ask or a comment that you'd like to make, please just put a line in the chat. And in that way, I know the order in which people registered a desire to speak, and I will call on you in the order that you registered. I wonder if I could start with one of my own. And I'd like to take us back to the noble savage and quote unquote dirty dog dichotomy that you mentioned early on. And as I've thought about this in the past, it struck me that it bears significant resemblances to Sigmund Freud's idea of the representation of women as either the Madonna or the whore, and sometimes it's given as the angel and the whore. And then when you were talking about paradoxical naturalness, it seemed that there was a very similar thing going on, that that Amerindian people are presented either as the epitome of the natural or as grossly unnatural. And I'm not sure where to go with all of that. And I think my question is going to end up inviting you to reflect on what you think that might be doing. Is it that the aboriginality is functioning as a frame, demarcating both the limits, if you like, the higher limit, so to speak, and the lower limit of humanity? Both the angel and the whore, both the noble savage and the dirty dog. And in that way, it's contributing to this dynamic that you very persuasively argue for, that actually it's defining the limits of political thought. And just one footnote on that. It seems that both civilization and savagery at this point are folded into aboriginality. There is almost the civilized aboriginality of the noble savage, and then there's the savage aboriginality of the dirty dog, so to speak. And that complicates, I think, the relationship between civilization and aboriginality in really interesting ways. Anyway, so that's the inchoate set of reflections that I'm trying to grapple with and work out what to do with. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that.
I will try. Yeah, those are very interesting points. To me, there is kind of three things here that are interesting to think about, and I have to say, and to work more about. Some I just don't have any proper answer, and please let me know if I'm misunderstanding you here. But to me, there is first the idea of gender and the way gender and sexuality plays in this, and I think it is very important. There is something there that is almost, I don't know, obvious. Also with the unnatural aspects of sexuality as well to Christian standards at that time. This is a recurrent theme. And yeah, like this is something that I would like to research more in a way. But I have to say I am not at all a specialist of gender studies or and so I just don't have enough knowledge of this. I know that, you know, Hobbes himself, so if we go back to Hobbes, yeah, know a little bit more about what he has to say about gender and about women, which is also very little. Yeah, there's something that is interesting there as well, is that, you know, naturally there is no distinction in a way in terms of the type of authority and power a man and a woman can have, and even that suggestion that because the woman actually, you know, gives birth and that this has biological dependence, that there might be more importance there or more power there in the state of nature. But we definitively find the same idea that in the state of nature or in a state of savagery, kind of gender become confused or not as important as they would be in a civilized society. In a way, a civilized society in a society that can make difference between gender. And here I would say probably an interesting, and I'm sure some feminist scholars and specialists of gender studies have done that. Actually, I wonder if we have this with some Foucauldian scholar as well on imperialism. I'm thinking here is the distinction between what I called aboriginalism, this view of indigenous people, and Orientalism in Edward Said type of critique. Because Orientalism is the fear of the other civilization in a way. And it is very clear that to Europeans, even though there can be some accusation that Orientals, I'm sorry, I'm just putting every time, are being effeminate or something like that, there are clear gender distinctions. And that is in a way a sign of a fellow civilization. With indigenous people, not so much. And that leads me to, I think, the second point you were mentioning, is like, how is this incorporating in a certain thought of the limits or even liminal space, this type of things. And this is also very interesting. I think here a way to investigate it more, and that's also something I didn't really have a chance to do. In particular, because my Greek is not good enough, but I'll be working on it, is the distinction between the ancient idea of barbarism and the modern idea of savagery. Foucault talks about this in his Society Must Be Defended. He pits the savage against the barbarian. The barbarian is the one that burns down a civilization, whereas the savage is the one that has no civilization, but it also means it's not a threat. And so the barbarian is the one that lives in that liminal space of the empire, kind of literally for the Romans. But the savage is not part of the empire, nor is it a threat to the empire. So there is something that, to me, is much more black and white in a way. So once again, civilization, aboriginality, complete absence of civilization, something that is much more dual rather than, you know, the type of things that can go on with the liminal space. But once again, I don't have a good answer. I think there might be one, and it is worth investigating. And in particular, at least the road I would see for that is that comparison between ancient barbarism and even medieval sense of wilderness as well, because medieval wild men, they're always in the forest. Right? There's this whole thought of the forest. And actually, going back to this type of conceptions of the other, there are some very interesting contrasts in medieval culture, and this is linked to Christianity and biblical imagery, the distinction between the space of the desert and the space of the forest, and the people who live in each. That's very, very interesting in like medieval conceptions of wilderness and of the other. And so, like, yeah, is the forest a liminal space, or once again, the absence of society? I'll leave it at that. I don't have truly a proper answer. And I did do a third point, and now I've forgotten about what. Oh yes, sorry, the noble savage, dirty dog, that opposition. I think in a way, a lot of what I've read suggests that it does not matter in a way. So what I mean is that there is a little bit as well of, linguistic or national specificity. Like the noble savage tends to be more French. There is no doubt, kind of statistically in the writings. It's a French thing. The dirty dog or a noble savage tends to be more British or in English language in the literature. And the thing is that they may seem so opposed, this type of writings, but I think at the end of the day, once again, it is their sympathy or antipathy that determines which way they're going to go. But the four themes that I've mentioned, they're all there. It's just that for some reason that we could explore, the French tend to like it. And then those writing in English language tend to not like it so much. I know it's much more complicated than this. I am well placed to actually know it's much more complicated than this because not only in Canada right now, but very close to, the areas of what would have been New France, so Franco-Ontarian, Métis culture. So it is not just literature. It does have a very concrete consequences for the way territories are colonized and the way populations interact in settler, in settler colonialism, for sure. But I think that in terms of the themes and the theories behind it, the core, the idea of civilization remains. So another way to put it, it doesn't matter if you're Hobbes and the state of nature seems pretty bad, or if you're Rousseau and the state of nature seems pretty good, you are still using indigenous people in this way where you're pitting them outside of the political. You have a very different conception of the political, for sure, but you are still pitting indigenous people and aboriginality with all of these characteristics and prejudices outside of the political and outside of the civitas.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that wonderfully rich answer to a very imprecise question. Karen, could I invite you to pose your question or add your comment now?
Hi, yeah, I guess I'm a bit worried about what I've sort of suggested as a chicken and egg question, because yes, if you like, the discovery of these other peoples may have led to the interpretation of them as being outside civilization. But there's already and it partly depends on who you think is important in history. There's already in Christine de Pizan and in other medieval authors, so I know Christine better than others, she, in her history of Charles V, she explains the origin of monarchy, which in a sense that she's thinking of the origin of the state, as having risen because it was the general will that, well, the people of Earth were divided into realms, and in order to avoid the ills of a world without justice, and humanity being naturally inclined to carry out murders, thefts, and other crimes, the old and wise determined that the wisest and most virtuous should be elected governors over all others. So you've already got there a kind of version of the, well, this is state before government, where there are murders and etc. You know, it's if you like, Hobbes's state of nature. And then there's the contract, we accept government. Now, it may be that already having this view on the origins of government, then the Europeans interpret these other places without strong government in the light of their own theory about the origin of a civilized world. But, you know, I mean, I just don't think Hobbes is actually that important in the history. There's so much more history. You know, Christine had already written a book of the body politic that had been translated into English in 1521. There's, who knows whether, you know, Hobbes got the De Corpore politic. I mean, you know, but Christine was also, had known about Plato from her father, probably. So it just seems to say that somehow the origins of our thought of civilization, with civilization is supposed to be, you know, a realm that is governed, in which there are citizens, you know, the city of God, I mean, which is a trope that Christine's using, all comes about this sort of point where we meet the savage. It just seemed a bit making too much. Yes, anyway. So there's a chicken and egg sort of question about how, whether Europeans see the other world through their own theories, or whether, as it were, the theory grows up out of this engagement with the other world.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that question and that comment. I think that, yes, you're probably right. We assume, you know, we construct too much novelty into something that is already there. And with the shock that happens with the discovery of the new world, you know, that is going to be there. The reflex of Europeans to try and use old categories anyway to make sense of that new world. I think here the author that I rely the most on is Anthony Pagden, who's written a lot about especially the early colonial times in South America. And he explains very much how this works kind of cognitively and so on. I'll try still to make a defense for the originality of the discovery of the New World and the originality of Hobbes on this. So maybe the originality of Hobbes. Yes, ideas of social contract, this type of ideas for politics were there before. In particular, here I would refer back to Foundations of Modern Political Thought by Quentin Skinner. Talks about the monarchomac, all of these ideas of covenant and so on, and the influence of Protestantism and all of this. So we can have very similar concepts and ideas emerging at the time in Europe. Once again, I'm not trying to say that the European context is not the most important. Even on the idea of a state of nature, we actually have Cicero that has description of state of nature. So, you know, kind of either golden age or British state of nature type of things in Cicero. And then, of course, In Plato, we have Socrates in Crito, who expresses the idea of having some type of social contract with the city of Athens. I think I've also heard some people talking about Homer epics as, you know, having similar ideas out there as well. So what makes, I think, Hobbes special there is that, to me, is the first one to theorize it like that. That is to make something that systematic, as he would say himself, this new science of politics. And the fact that it is not just an analogy or an allegory like it is in Crito. It is not just a type of mythical rhetorical tool that it is in Cicero. It is not just an engagement with different theories of monarchies and their, I would say, kind of faltering certainties at the end of Middle Ages, but that rather it's a whole investigation of political anthropology, human nature, once again, this new science, this full new science that is trying to do. I think that is new. And I think that, you know, that provides the, in a way, the framework, or that sets the limits of the way we can think about the modern state in that case. So I realize, you know, this is my own penchant for Hobbes. I probably make him to be much more important than he actually is. I apologize for that. But it's a change from, I mean, I don't know, I'm sorry, for that matter, I don't remember how it was when I was a student in Australia. I can certainly say that when I was a student in Canada, people may have made too much of a big deal of John Locke. So it was nice to go back to Hobbes for that. But and in France, people make way too much of Rousseau.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I fear that we probably all make rather too much of our pet theorists. Stephanie Smith, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such an interesting talk. And it's not so much of a question as just kind of an idea I wanted to pose, and just kind of, there's so many interesting parts, but one that really struck me was this idea of the far away long ago fallacy and the paradoxical naturalness. And that those ideas in relation to the image on the cover of De Kive, which is sort of the depictions of sort of the colonial versus the sort of state of nature. And I just kind of, these ideas, I was thinking about them in relation to this sort of tension within Hobbes and other thinkers of the time that you were mentioning, which is that they can't really, these unresolved tensions between ideas of the state of nature as being, or the idea of like the origins of humankind being far away, but unnatural, and sort of this sort of reconciling there. And I was just wondering if that could be some sort of reconciliation that they're trying to have within themselves about these ideas of unnaturalness, and maybe sin, and or good traits that are not there, and things like that, between the civilized and the state of nature. Because on the cover of De Kive, they're right next to each other. So it seems like perhaps these thinkers are struggling to maybe push these ideas away from themselves of, you know, there's this colonial idea of superiority and things like that, but they are actually having a hard time pushing them far away. And Hobbes, I know, a lot of his theory is based on fear. So maybe that's those underlying fears, that there is actually no distinction. They're closer than they might try to make out. So that's just kind of one idea I'd love to get your thoughts on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think exactly. This is a projection of fears, of desires, of um, of masculine insecurities, and yeah, it's so visible, I would say, almost right from the beginning. Also, actually, I'm thinking about Christopher Columbus. And is there, maybe I've just not paid attention to it, so there could be some very sexual things going on or being mentioned in the journals. I'm not thinking about it. He was obsessed by gold, so maybe that took over everything. Gold was everything. You can see in the depiction of cannibalism as well that, this pouring of gold in the mouth of the conquistador for torture. And so maybe gold was so important that they weren't thinking about sexuality and gender as much. But no, more seriously, yeah, like this is so much of a projection of Western sense of inadequacies. And here, once again, it is very gendered. Well, the authors would be male, and especially at that time of the colonization, the conquistadors themselves would be male, and in Montaigne of Cannibals, this is actually so, like, you can see, like, the homoeroticism is just kind of all over the place in there. Then also, like, I don't know, he even has comments about how they would have better sex as well. I mean, it's just, yeah, something. So it's very present, not as present in Hobbes, probably. But we can see that there's this projection of their own sense of inadequacies is all over the place. I do want to mention, and then, sorry, we could go back to Freudian things going on as well. But there is, however, I think something maybe worth exploring is that this projection of inadequacies and in particular of male insecurities, this is something that is very present in any type of thinking about barbarians. So they would have the same type of thinking with European barbaric people. And the Greeks maybe not as much, they don't really care about barbarians, very simply. But certainly with the Romans, we have, I mean, the whole obsession with the German, the Scandinavian, and probably in Europe still to this day. And of course, there's, well, German nationalism and Nazism and so on. This obsession with what Nietzsche calls the blonde beast, which is definitively a feeling of masculine insecurity, impotency, and so on, of having, also your woman stolen, by those men, and, your gene and heredity stolen as well by those men. I think we have that with the Americas as well. So in a way, I would say, these projections is not specific to the Americas. Those are projections that happen with a lot of people that are considered as others. It's very common, in a way, it's very common for Europeans to feel insecure in regards to other people. What would be very interesting is to see what would be specific about this. And then once again, I think it goes back to your first comment, Chris, this indistinction of gender or unnatural sexuality type of thing. I think that is different here. Germanic tribes would have never been described as, the men of Germanic tribes would have never been described as androgynous or not masculine enough. On the contrary, would be an over-masculinization and an over-feminization of these people. In the case of indigenous Americans, it's the contrary. once again, I'm sure maybe some people have investigated. I just don't know the reasons behind that.
Thank you so much. We are drawing to a close. I wonder if I could just squeeze in one quick question to end, and feel free to answer very briefly if you'd like to. It comes off the back of what Stephanie Smith was just saying about the frontispiece to De Kiwe. And it struck me that the two words that are used to describe the two figures are imperium and libertas. And libertas seems to be framed here as something that is supremely undesirable. Like, why on earth would we want freedom? That's a terrible thing to want. And I just wondered if you had any comments on that. I think I've read elsewhere that the Western positive valuing of freedom was imported from New World values. And is this then an instance of the sort of the Western view of freedom before it was shaped by this encounter with the Americas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right now I can't remember the name of the book, but I think it is something like The Americas and the Allegory of Freedom. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the author as well. But yeah, I see what you're referring to. I would have to say, once again, it has to be a modern idea of freedom. I'm not quite convinced. It could be a chicken and egg problem here, and even more so, I would say, than the previous one. It's like we have new conceptions of freedom coming in, and then this new word coming in, and they're gonna, protect them on that word. On the libertas being depicted negatively, and sorry, I was looking because I had that text by me just before, but now it's gone. Quentin Skinner wrote about that frontispiece quite a few times, actually. I think probably the main comment is when he his book on rhetorics in Hobbes, but then I just read a piece before this talk that was a 2021 talk by Quentin Skinner, published in 22. That's the one I quoted when I said that Hobbes was pioneering the frontispiece, the art of frontispiece. And he addresses just that. Of course, it's Quentin Skinner, and and libertas is going to be important to him. How dare one depict libertas negatively? And so he addresses that questions right there. I think we have to understand that this is a peek at classical republicanism, actually, indeed, from Hobbes, to dare have libertas represented that way. So, but it could be interesting as well. Same thing, would Hobbes be fully aware of this kind of collusion of images? Because in a way, we would have his natural freedom, or his natural liberty, let's use liberty, his natural liberty depicted there. But to me, it's a very modern idea of liberty. And or a modern non-Republican, I don't know if I want to call it liberal, but non-Republican idea of liberty. And same thing, Quentin Skinner shows that genealogy of freedom as absence of restriction and so on from Hobbes up until today's conceptions of freedom. Freedom as non-interference, as he calls it. So to me, it's the same thing. It's a very modern idea that we find in Hobbes. I think that when he uses the Latin libertas, and when the engraver uses the Latin libertas, it has to be referring to classical liberty rather than that natural liberty. But the fact that the collusion is for sure so interesting that you would depict this classical Republican libertas with the horror of what Hobbes calls natural liberty. Same word, different realities, both together in the same picture, in probably a shocking way for many, many people. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Alma's just put a comment in the chat here very helpfully that Graeber and Wengrow also make the same argument about the importation of concepts of freedom, I think, in the dawn of everything. So thank you, Alma, for drawing our attention to that. Well, we have not only reached the end, we have overshot the end, I'm afraid. My final question sent us into overtime, so I do apologize for that. But it all goes to show just how deeply fascinating all of this is, and how masterfully, Stéphanie, you have laid it out for us. So thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, for your generosity with responding to our questions. And it just remains for me to invite everyone to join me in thanking Stéphanie Martens today. Thank you so much.